Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of those strange corners of history that most textbooks politely avoid. You know, the children who were never supposed to exist, but somehow kept appearing anyway. Because, surprise, medieval kings weren't exactly famous for self-control. So dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's drift slowly into the lives of those awkward, half-acknowledged offspring of royal blood. These are the bastards of kings. Not my word, by the way. That's the actual historical label stamped onto them at birth like a lifetime of shame. You could be born in a palace, fathered by a monarch, and still be treated like a piece of inconvenient paperwork that needed to be hidden under a rug. And yet, despite the stigma, many of them lived remarkable, if not exactly enviable, lives. Some became generals, some became pawns, and others became tragedies waiting to happen. Now, the first thing to know about medieval bastards is that legitimacy mattered a lot more than biology. You could be the healthiest, smartest child a king ever produced. But if your mother wasn't officially wearing a crown at the time, you were basically born with an invisible sign around your neck reading "Not allowed to inherit." This legal distinction obsessed the medieval world to a ridiculous degree. Royal genealogists tied themselves into knots over it, while kings pretended to be shocked that anyone would accuse them of fathering illegitimate kids, while also having entire courts full of mistresses. Take William the Conqueror, for example. He was, ironically enough, William the Bastard before he rebranded himself as Conqueror. Imagine that glow-up. Born in Normandy around 1028, his father was Duke Robert I, and his mother was a tanner's daughter named Herleva. Not exactly the princess material the court had in mind. When little William came along, he was stuck with the rather brutal label, the Bastard, which is not the kind of nickname that wins you popularity points in the medieval playground, and yet he survived. More than that, he clawed his way up through assassination attempts, political chaos, and nobles sneering at his birth. Eventually, he invaded England in 1066 and made the entire world forget that awkward childhood epithet. If there's ever been an argument for not underestimating bastards, William's your poster child. Although, in fairness, he had to slaughter half of England to make it happen, but William was unusual. Most illegitimate royal kids weren't given armies and destiny. They were given monasteries, marriage contracts, or if their fathers were particularly cold, nothing at all. Kings had a habit of producing dozens of such children, but then pretending they were completely irrelevant once dynastic politics got involved. Let's float over to England in the 12th century. King Henry I of England, son of William the Conqueror, was particularly enthusiastic in the child-making department. Officially, he had 2 legitimate children with his wife, but unofficially, the man was practically running a daycare. Historians estimate that he fathered over 20 illegitimate children. 20, at minimum. Some say it might have been closer to 30. That's not a family tree, that's a forest. Of course, Henry didn't treat them all equally. Some daughters were married off to local nobles, others were packed off into convents, while a few sons were given enough recognition to carve out military careers. One of his most famous bastards was Robert, Earl of Gloucester, who became one of his father's strongest supporters. Without Robert, Henry's line might have collapsed entirely during the messy civil war known as the Anarchy. So ironically, while the legitimate heirs were dying in shipwrecks and sparking wars, it was the illegitimate kid keeping the dynasty afloat. And yet, no matter how useful they were, they could never fully escape the bastard label. Robert was loyal, brilliant, and politically essential, but he was barred from ever wearing the crown himself. Medieval society could handle a ruthless, blood-soaked king, but a king born on the wrong side of the sheets? Absolutely not. Now, if you're wondering why kings didn't just, make their mistresses their wives, the answer is politics. Marriage in the medieval world wasn't about love. It was about land, treaties, and producing heirs with the right bloodlines. A king marrying a mistress would have been like a CEO trying to merge with the janitorial staff. It simply wasn't allowed by the shareholders. So the kids born from those liaisons were left in an awkward in-between state. Acknowledged enough to be useful, denied enough to keep the nobility happy. France had its own colourful collection of royal bastards. King Charles II of Navarre, known as Charles the Bad, and yes, that was his actual nickname, so you can imagine the vibe, had illegitimate children scattered about. One of them, Charles, was legitimized later in life because his father desperately needed political support. Nothing like suddenly deciding your bastard son is totally legitimate now, actually, when you need an extra ally. This trick, legitimization, was another common theme. Bastards could be legitimized by royal decree or papal approval, which instantly upgraded them from social outcast to dynastic player. But it was always conditional and usually done when convenient. If politics shifted, well, back to bastard status you go. The medieval world was nothing if not petty. And speaking of petty, let's not forget the Church's role in all this. The Catholic Church hated illegitimacy, at least on paper, but also couldn't afford to alienate kings. So they mostly scowled in the background while royal mistresses filled palaces, and then occasionally wagged a finger at especially brazen rulers. Which is how you end up with popes both condemning bastards and in some cases being bastards themselves. Hypocrisy was practically an inheritance of its own. So far we've seen bastards as military leaders, political pawns, and convenient bargaining chips. But what about their personal lives? Did they ever get to just live sometimes? Many illegitimate daughters were married off to minor nobles, creating little dynastic side branches. Some did fairly well, others ended up in obscure corners of Europe, remembered only as so-and-so, the bastard daughter of King whoever. Their main job was to cement alliances, which sounds romantic until you realize it meant being shipped off at 14 to marry a man twice your age because your father thought it would help secure a border. And then there's the more tragic side. For every Robert of Gloucester, there were dozens of forgotten children quietly sent to monasteries or convents, their royal blood locked away behind cloisters. Some were even denied acknowledgement entirely, erased from the official record as if they'd never existed. And yet genealogists keep finding them, hidden in margins of manuscripts, footnotes of chronicles, or scandalized rumors whispered by courtiers. It's worth remembering that while we romanticize kings and queens, their family trees were a mess of half-acknowledged branches. The official line of succession was often held together with duct tape and denial. Behind every polished royal portrait, there were half-siblings in the shadows, wondering why they couldn't sit at the main table. And with that, let's slowly drift over to another royal household, where illegitimate children played an even stranger role. More royal bastards, from France to Spain, so where were we? Right, half-siblings lurking in the shadows of royal portraits. Let's float gently across the channel and peek at another dynasty where bastards weren't just footnotes, but sometimes became the loudest voices in the family drama. France, in particular, had a knack for producing royal bastards who refused to stay in the background. The Valois kings of the late Middle Ages were prolific in more ways than one, and their children born outside of wedlock often went on to become dukes, generals, or schemers in their own right. The French court practically had a revolving door for mistresses, and out of that came a steady trickle of half-official offspring. Take King Charles VII of France, for example. You might remember him as the one who owed his crown to Joan of Arc, though he wasn't exactly sprinting to thank her. Charles had a wife, of course, but his real affection went to Agnès Sorel, one of the earliest women in Europe to be openly recognized as a royal mistress. She set the standard, pearls and all. Naturally, children followed. These daughters of Agnès weren't in line for the throne, but Charles doted on them enough to secure them good marriages, which, in medieval terms, meant handing them over to whichever noble could offer the right amount of loyalty or land. And it wasn't just daughters. Some illegitimate sons were strategically placed in positions of power. The French kings understood that while a bastard couldn't inherit the crown, he could be trusted to wield a sword in defense of it, especially if that son knew his entire livelihood depended on royal favor, which is how you get families like the Bourbons and Orléans later benefiting from carefully planted illegitimate roots. But the French didn't stop there. By the Renaissance, the idea of recognizing royal bastards became almost fashionable. King Francis I of France, the Renaissance prince, had a string of illegitimate children who were so well cared for that courtiers began to whisper about whether being born on the wrong side of the sheets was really all that wrong after all. These kids received education, estates and positions, and while they didn't get crowns, they certainly didn't get ignored. Spain, on the other hand, tells a different story. Spanish kings weren't quite as liberal with public recognition, though mistresses and illegitimate children certainly existed. The problem was that Spanish politics revolved around the fragile balance of Christian kingdoms against Moorish states, and legitimacy carried heavy symbolic weight. An illegitimate heir risked fracturing alliances. Still, bastards cropped up, hidden in monasteries, quietly married into noble families, or used to cement loyalty among lesser houses. Take King Alfonso the Fiend of Castile. He had a long-term mistress, Leonor de Guzman, who bore him 10 children. Yes, 10. And unlike many rulers, Alfonso openly favored them, often over his legitimate heir. That favoritism sparked major tensions. After Alfonso's death, his legitimate wife's supporters went after Leonor, had her imprisoned and eventually executed. Her sons, however, didn't disappear. In fact, they became central figures in Spanish politics, with one eventually founding the powerful Trastamara dynasty that ruled Castile for generations. So, from mistresses' children to dynasty founders, quite the upgrade. Notice a pattern. Bastards, though technically sidelined, had a habit of sneaking back into the spotlight. You could try to erase them from the official line, but somehow politics or sheer ambition dragged them right back in. And while we're drifting through these stories, it's worth pausing on the emotional side again. Imagine being a royal bastard in this world. Your father is king of half a continent, but you can't sit at the big table during feasts. You might be acknowledged, but never fully embraced. You're useful, but never quite enough. You might be given castles, wealth, and even respect, but there's always that invisible ceiling above you. That one word, bastard, was enough to keep you in your place. Still, some of them turned that into fuel. Others carried it as a lifelong wound. And a few, as we'll see, used it to reshape entire dynasties. So let's drift over now to Scotland and see how illegitimacy played out in a land famous for fierce clans, brutal politics, and a chronic shortage of peaceful successions. Part 2, More Royal Bastards, from France to Spain. Where were we? Right, half-siblings lurking in the shadows of royal portraits. Let's float gently across the channel and peek at another dynasty where bastards weren't just footnotes, but sometimes became the loudest voices in the family drama. France, in particular, had a knack for producing royal bastards who refused to stay in the background. The Valois kings of the late Middle Ages were prolific in more ways than one, and their children born outside of wedlock often went on to become dukes, generals, or schemers in their own right. The French court practically had a revolving door for mistresses, and out of that came a steady trickle of half-official offspring. Take King Charles VII of France, for example. You might remember him as the one who owed his crown to Joan of Arc, though he wasn't exactly sprinting to thank her. Charles had a wife, of course, but his real affection went to Agnès Sorel, one of the earliest women in Europe to be openly recognized as a royal mistress. She set the standard, pearls and all. Naturally, children followed. These daughters of Agnès weren't in line for the throne, but Charles doted on them enough to secure them good marriages, which, in medieval terms, meant handing them over to whichever noble could offer the right amount of loyalty or land. And it wasn't just daughters. Some illegitimate sons were strategically placed in positions of power. The French kings understood that while a bastard couldn't inherit the crown, he could be trusted to wield a sword in defense of it, especially if that son knew his entire livelihood depended on royal favor, which is how you get families like the Bourbons and Orléans later benefiting from carefully planted illegitimate roots. But the French didn't stop there. By the Renaissance, the idea of recognizing royal bastards became almost fashionable. King Francis I of France, the Renaissance prince, had a string of illegitimate children who were so well cared for that courtiers began to whisper about whether being born on the wrong side of the sheets was really all that wrong after all. These kids received education, estates and positions, and while they didn't get crowns, they certainly didn't get ignored. Spain, on the other hand, tells a different story. Spanish kings weren't quite as liberal with public recognition, though mistresses and illegitimate children certainly existed. The problem was that Spanish politics revolved around the fragile balance of Christian kingdoms against Moorish states, and legitimacy carried heavy symbolic weight. An illegitimate heir risked fracturing alliances. Still, bastards cropped up, hidden in monasteries, quietly married into noble families, or used to cement loyalty among lesser houses. Take King Alfonso V of Castile. He had a long-term mistress, Leonor de Guzman, who bore him 10 children. Yes, 10. And unlike many rulers, Alfonso openly favored them, often over his legitimate heir. That favoritism sparked major tensions. After Alfonso's death, his legitimate wife's supporters went after Leonor, had her imprisoned and eventually executed. Her sons, however, didn't disappear. In fact, they became central figures in Spanish politics, with one eventually founding the powerful Trastamara dynasty that ruled Castile for generations. So from mistresses' children to dynasty founders, quite the upgrade. Notice a pattern. Bastards, though technically sidelined, had a habit of sneaking back into the spotlight. You could try to erase them from the official line, but somehow politics or sheer ambition dragged them right back in. And while we're drifting through these stories, it's worth pausing on the emotional side again. Imagine being a royal bastard in this world. Your father is king of half a continent, but you can't sit at the big table during feasts. You might be acknowledged, but never fully embraced. You're useful, but never quite enough. You might be given castles, wealth, and even respect, but there's always that invisible ceiling above you. That one word, bastard, was enough to keep you in your place. Still, some of them turned that into fuel. Others carried it as a lifelong wound. And a few, as we'll see, used it to reshape entire dynasties. So let's drift over now to Scotland and see how illegitimacy played out in a land famous for fierce clans, brutal politics, and a chronic shortage of peaceful successions. Scotland, Renaissance courts, and the bastard badge of honor. So here we are, drifting north to Scotland, a land where kings were constantly in short supply. Nobles had the patience of caffeinated hornets, and illegitimacy was less a scandal than a fact of dynastic life. As mentioned before, Robert II of Scotland practically filled the Highlands with descendants. The man was industrious, And while some of his illegitimate children faded quietly into clan genealogies, others popped up in Scottish politics like stubborn weeds. It's one of the reasons Scottish noble networks became so messy. You never quite knew which rival lord might also be your half-uncle, or whether the man leading troops against you was secretly another branch of the royal family. But the real star among Scottish royal bastards was James Stuart, the illegitimate son of James V, known as the Earl of Moray. He wasn't just some pampered half-brother. He became regent for Mary, Queen of Scots, which is about as close to ruling as a bastard could get. Picture it. You're born on the wrong side of the bed, and then you end up running Scotland while your legitimate half-sister languishes in prison. The irony writes itself. His life ended with an assassination, because of course it did, but his career remains one of the clearest examples of just how far illegitimate children could rise. Now, Scotland wasn't unique. By the Renaissance, something fascinating happened across Europe. Being a royal bastard shifted from an automatic life sentence of obscurity to something a little more fashionable, especially in courts like France and Italy, where flaunting your illegitimate children could even enhance your reputation as a virile monarch. Because what better way to show power than by proving you could scatter your DNA like confetti across the nobility? Francis I of France made this trend almost official. His illegitimate kids received careful educations, fine marriages, and cushy estates. They didn't just exist, they thrived. Courtiers, ever the gossips, muttered that it was sometimes better to be one of Francis's bastards than a legitimate child of a lesser noble. After all, the illegitimate offspring had charisma, royal backing, and usually a mother who had charmed the king himself. That counted for a lot in the twisted calculus of court life, and Italy, oh Italy, perfected the art of turning bastards into dynastic tools. The Borgias, for instance, didn't even blink at the word illegitimacy. Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI, yes, the Pope, had multiple children with his mistress Vanozza de Catane. Everyone knew, nobody cared. His children were openly raised, married into powerful families, and in Cesare Borgia's case became one of the most infamous military commanders of the Renaissance. Not bad for kids who were technically not supposed to exist at all. By this point, bastard was still a social mark, but the sting varied. In stiffly traditional Spain, it could get you exiled or ignored. In flamboyant Italy, it might earn you a command. In France, it was increasingly an open secret that everyone shrugged about while pretending to care. It was less about morality and more about utility. If you could serve the dynasty, you were in. If you couldn't, well, back to the monastery. And let's not forget England in the Tudor era. Henry VIII, of course, is famous for his obsession with legitimate heirs. Yet even he acknowledged at least one illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. Fitzroy was showered with titles, raised almost like a crown prince, and there were whispers that Henry might actually try to make him his heir if things with Anne Boleyn didn't work out. Spoiler, they didn't, but Fitzroy died young and the whole awkward situation fizzled out. Still, it shows how tempting the idea was, even for a king obsessed with legitimacy. So by the late Renaissance, the bastard label had become less of a death sentence and more of a wild card. Depending on your father's mood, your mother's status, and your own luck, you could end up in a cloister or running half a kingdom. Not exactly fair, but then again, medieval Europe was never really big on fairness. Let's drift now into some of the strangest individual stories, those forgotten children who didn't just live in the shadow of the crown, but left odd, sometimes tragic, fingerprints on history, tragedies, exiles, and the strange fates of forgotten bastards, if Part 3 was about the surprising heights royal bastards could reach. Then part 4 is where the tone darkens. Because for every Earl of Moray or Cesare Borgia, there were countless others whose lives were snuffed out early, buried in obscurity, or deliberately erased from the family tree. Let's start with France again, because if there was ever a land that mass-produced illegitimate children, it was France. While Francis I flaunted his bastards, other monarchs weren't so generous. Some were quietly tucked into abbeys as children, never to emerge again. So a convent or monastery might sound peaceful, but for these children, it was closer to a gilded prison. They weren't allowed to marry, couldn't own property, and lived in perpetual reminder that their existence was a problem to be managed. England too had its share of tragic cases. Consider the many illegitimate children of Henry I. Some of them were married off, but others were used as pawns in political games. And in the worst cases, they were flat-out murdered during rebellions or imprisoned by rivals who saw them as dangerous half-claims to the throne. That's grim, but dynastic politics didn't leave much room for sentimentality. Even when bastards weren't directly harmed, they were often trapped in exile. Picture being shipped off to live in another country, stripped of your royal connections, and forced to make your way as a minor noble in a foreign land. That was the fate of more than one bastard of the Holy Roman Emperors, who ended up in places like Bohemia or Hungary, existing on the fringes of court life, forever aware that they had been cast off. And then there were the strangest cases, the ones that read like forgotten Gothic novellas. Some illegitimate children became wandering knights, mercenaries for hire, trading on the vague whiff of royal blood to make themselves desirable commanders. Others lived in permanent disguise, never publicly acknowledged, only whispered about by chroniclers. There's even evidence that some bastards were deliberately left unrecorded in official documents, their names lost to time so completely that historians only stumble across them in stray letters or obscure local chronicles. But perhaps the saddest stories belong to the daughters. If you were a son, there was at least the possibility of land knighthood or military glory. Daughters, on the other hand, were bargaining chips. They were married off to cement alliances, often to men much older, or tucked into nunneries where their lives disappeared into silence. One Venetian observer noted that illegitimate daughters of kings and dukes were given like coins in the marriage market, their royal blood valued, but their personal lives entirely expendable. And hovering over all of this was the ever-present fear of being too successful. Because here's the cruel irony. If you were a bastard who managed to rise too high, if your charm, ambition, or military skill made you stand out, you risked becoming a target. Kings and queens might tolerate their illegitimate siblings or children in positions of power, until those siblings started looking a little too much like rivals. Then came the exile, the poison cup, or the sudden hunting accident. So for every tale of glamour and political intrigue, there were dozens more of abandonment, enforced silence, and slow erasure. Bastards lived in a precarious balance, too invisible and you were forgotten, too visible and you were dangerous. In part 5, we'll peel back the last layer, how literature and culture remembered or deliberately misremembered these children, turning their real struggles into legends, cautionary tales, and sometimes outright propaganda. Bastards in memory, legend, and propaganda. So far we've lingered over the living realities of royal bastards, their strange half-lives as pawns, generals, or forgotten names scribbled in monastery rolls. But history doesn't just remember people for what they were. It reshapes them. It retells, it edits, it spins. And for illegitimate children of kings, that meant their reputations often lived on in ways that were more symbolic than factual. Let's start with the most obvious place: literature. Medieval and Renaissance writers had a particular fascination with bastards. They were convenient archetypes, too low-born to be heirs, too high-born to be ignored. In plays, ballads, and chronicles, they appear as ambitious schemers, tragic lovers, or dark reminders of sin. Think of Shakespeare's King John, where the bastard Philip Falconbridge is written as both comic relief and moral commentator. He's witty, sarcastic, half insider and half outsider. Shakespeare knew exactly how useful a bastard could be for storytelling. They lived in between worlds, and that made them narrators of sorts, figures who could see both sides of power. But literature wasn't always flattering. Bastards were also weaponized in political propaganda. Chroniclers sometimes exaggerated or invented illegitimate children as a way to discredit rivals. If you wanted to tarnish a noble family, you'd hint that their grandmother was of doubtful birth. Lineage was everything, and planting a rumor of illegitimacy could erode a dynasty's prestige like termites in the beams of a house. And then there were the legends. Over time, some bastards blurred into myth. In Portugal, Spain, and parts of Italy, popular tales told of wandering bastard princes who traveled incognito, performed heroic deeds, and eventually claimed their rightful places. Of course, the reality was usually far less glamorous, but folklore thrives on the what if. What if the forgotten son came back? What if the illegitimate daughter was secretly blessed with divine favor? These stories reflected the public's uneasy fascination. Bastards were symbols of both fragility and possibility. In many cases, monarchs themselves leaned into this symbolic power. A king might acknowledge his bastards publicly, not just for politics, but to signal his virility, his strength, his overflowing dynasty. The message was clear. Look how much life and power I can spread, even outside the confines of marriage. This wasn't morality, it was marketing. And yet culture also preserved the sting. The very word bastard hardened into one of the sharpest insults in European languages. Even centuries later, the term carried with it the memory of exclusion, of being almost but not quite worthy. That's a heavy inheritance, one that bled from legal statutes into common speech. By the early modern period, as dynasties consolidated and succession laws became stricter, bastards slipped further into cultural margins. But the fascination remained. Writers, poets, and later novelists continued to mine the theme for drama. The child who should have been, the heir denied, the outsider within. It's a trope we still see today, recycled endlessly in fiction, fantasy, and film. So, if you're lying there now in the dark, imagining the lonely lives of these half-royals, know this: they never entirely vanished. Maybe they lost their thrones, maybe they never had a chance at them. But their presence lingered, in whispered rumors, in chroniclers' margins, in the way we still use their name as shorthand for being left out. They remind us that history isn't just about the winners, it's also about the nearlies, the almosts, the shadows cast by crowns. And with that, let's gently close our eyes on these forgotten children. They were neither fully royal nor fully common. They lived in that uneasy twilight, and perhaps that's why their memory still glows faintly, centuries later, like candlelight that refuses to be blown out. Closing reflections, shadows of the crown, and so as we reach the quiet end of this journey, we can see how the story of royal bastards was never one single tale but 1,000 fractured echoes. Some lived with privilege, others with shame. Some commanded armies, others faded into the footnotes of dusty chronicles. A few became legends, immortalized as clever outsiders or tragic heirs denied. Their existence forced kingdoms to wrestle with uncomfortable truths. How much of power is blood? How much is law? And how much is simply performance? The illusion of legitimacy upheld because people agreed to believe in it. Bastards sat precisely at that fault line. They were proof that kings were human, that desire often overruled duty, that crowns were fragile things held together by stories as much as by swords. It is telling that even now, centuries later, the word bastard lingers on our tongues. Sharp and stinging, it carries with it a medieval weight, the echo of closed doors, of denied thrones, of children both acknowledged and erased. They remind us that history is not only about the rulers who sat on gilded thrones, but also about those who stood just beside them, so close, yet forever outside. So if you are lying awake now, eyes heavy as these words drift past, perhaps you can picture them. The forgotten daughters married off in quiet ceremonies, the unclaimed sons staring at castles they would never inherit, the acknowledged few riding at their father's side in battle, half proud, half resentful. They are not the kings and queens in your history books, but their shadows stretch across the pages just the same. And in those shadows, in those almosts and never-wases, lies a story as human as any dynasty ever told. A story not of crowns but of longing, not of legitimacy but of survival. And with that, dear listener, let us finally set this chapter to rest. The bastards of medieval Europe are gone, their names blurred, their faces forgotten. Yet their presence lingers like a fading candle in a darkened hall, small, flickering, but impossible to erase. One that bled from legal statutes into common speech, from dusty rolls of inheritance disputes into the casual quarrels of taverns and streets. When someone spat out bastard, it carried all the centuries of shame, of doors closed, of thrones barred. It was not just a word, it was the echo of history itself. And so memory became a second life for these forgotten children. Some were remembered more vividly in fiction than in fact, their true selves swallowed by archetypes. Others vanished almost entirely, leaving behind nothing but a rumor of scandal. That's the strange fate of the illegitimate. History doesn't quite know where to place them. They are not kings, not quite nobodies. Instead, they hover in the margins, resurfacing when the story requires an outsider's voice, or when a dynasty needs a convenient villain, or when folklore hungers for a lost heir. It's ironic, isn't it? The same kings who spent so much effort denying them, burying their names under silence, ended up creating a fertile space for legends. By excluding them, they gave them mythic power. By silencing them, they made them louder in memory. So tonight, as we let these voices drift, we can see how bastards lived two lives, one in their own time, full of limits and negotiations, and another in ours, as symbols, warnings, and whispers. Perhaps that is why they still fascinate us, because to study them is to glimpse the cracks in royal power, the little human failings that even a crown couldn't cover. And with that, let's slowly float to our final reflections, where these scattered stories settle into the larger shadow they cast over medieval history, one that bled from legal statutes into common speech, from dusty rolls of inheritance disputes into the casual quarrels of taverns and streets. When someone spat out bastard, it carried all the centuries of shame, of doors closed, of thrones barred. It was not just a word, it was the echo of history itself. And so memory became a second life for these forgotten children. Some were remembered more vividly in fiction than in fact, their true selves swallowed by archetypes. Others vanished almost entirely, leaving behind nothing but a rumor of scandal. That's the strange fate of the illegitimate. History doesn't quite know where to place them. They are not kings, not quite nobodies. Instead, they hover in the margins, resurfacing whenever the story requires an outsider's role. In chronicles, they often appear like footnotes, introduced only to explain a sudden inheritance dispute, or why a duke's lands had to be divided awkwardly. In literature, though, they find sharper form. The wronged son, the forgotten daughter, the shadow heir, These became tropes not just in plays and poems, but in the way people thought about real bastards too. Shakespeare's King Lear and King John mined that tension between legitimacy and exclusion, turning it into drama. Later writers would do the same. It was almost as if society needed the illegitimate to carry the burden of certain stories, especially those about envy, ambition, or betrayal. But behind the archetypes were people. Some were gentle, some cruel. Some bore their mark of illegitimacy quietly. Others turned it into fuel for endless ambition. They were not all tragic. They were not all bitter. They were, above all, inconvenient. And in history, being inconvenient often meant being erased. Yet erasure is never complete. Whispered stories linger. Legends attach themselves to old castles or half-remembered graves. You'll sometimes hear of the bastard of so-and-so, as if that label alone carried enough weight to stand in for a life. In that sense, they became both less than human and more than human at once, symbols as much as people, and that brings us to the peculiar endurance of their memory. Long after their bloodlines dissolved into the general population, the word itself remained. Bastard became one of the most enduring insults in European languages. Even today it survives, stripped of its precise medieval meaning, but still heavy with centuries of disdain. When we say it, we unknowingly echo the weight of dynastic shame, the anxiety of succession, the social obsession with bloodlines. So the bastard lived twice. Once in their own life, difficult, messy, often cut short, and again, in the collective imagination that carried them forward, exaggerated, distorted, but never entirely gone. That second life, in many ways, was longer. Let's drift now into those closing reflections, where we can see what their scattered shadows add up to, and why they still haunt our histories, even if their names have long since faded, resurfacing whenever the story requires an outsider's role. In chronicles, they often appear like footnotes, introduced only to explain a sudden inheritance dispute, or why a duke's lands had to be divided awkwardly. In literature, though, they became sharper characters. Playwrights, poets, and storytellers leaned on them as archetypes: the wrong child, the scheming rival, the half-forgotten heir who carried both pride and resentment. They were narrative tools, but also reflections of real anxieties about bloodlines and legitimacy. It is strange, then, how their historical absence turned into a kind of presence. By being denied thrones, they occupied another throne instead, the one in imagination. They ruled in stories, even if they never ruled in castles. That is perhaps their longest reign. So as we let this part settle, you might notice how bastards lived in two spaces. One in the medieval courts, where their names were often whispered or struck from records, and another in cultural memory, where they were exaggerated, dramatized, and never fully forgotten. And with that thought, let's drift toward the final reflections, where the threads of power, shame, and memory all knot together in the long shadow cast by the bastards of kings. In literature, though, they became sharper figures. The bastard was not just a marginal note, but a character type, a convenient embodiment of envy, ambition, or fate denied. Think of Shakespeare's Edmund in King Lear, who seethes against the injustice of being denied legitimacy, turning his bitterness into cold calculation. Or Philip the Bastard in King John, who becomes both commentator and player in the drama, his illegitimacy made into a stage presence rather than a private shame. Such depictions show us something telling. Even when bastards themselves had little power, their symbolic weight was enormous. They represented the fragility of succession, the cracks in dynastic myths, the reminder that kings could fall prey to very ordinary human impulses. Every illegitimate child born to a monarch was proof that control was never absolute, that desire could outpace duty, And that order was always one scandal away from collapse. But of course, fiction isn't history. The real children lived lives that were smaller, sadder, and often more mundane. Many ended up with quiet titles, minor inheritances, or comfortable marriages arranged to remove them from political temptation. Some joined the clergy, where celibacy conveniently solved the problem of further heirs. Others simply disappeared into obscurity, their lineage noted briefly, before being swallowed by the wider nobility or common folk. Yet even in these quiet fates, the cultural idea of the bastard grew. They became a mirror, reflecting society's obsession with bloodlines, legitimacy, and the illusion of perfect dynasties. Kings could not erase them from existence, but they could shape the story, calling some natural sons when useful, and others nameless when inconvenient. And this tension between the real and the symbolic, the lived life and the remembered archetype, is perhaps what makes their story linger. They were simultaneously erased and immortalized, forgotten in one breath, mythologized in the next. As we drift toward the close of this tale, we can see them more clearly now, not just as outcasts, but as figures who carried an outsized weight in the medieval imagination, shadows of crowns, bearers of shame, but also quiet witnesses to the fragility of royal power itself. And this tension between the real and the symbolic, the lived life and the remembered archetype, is perhaps what makes their story linger. They were simultaneously erased and immortalized, forgotten in one breath, mythologized in the next. We see it again and again across the medieval record. A royal bastard might be carefully hidden away, his name left out of official chronicles, yet songs and gossip in the streets would keep his story alive. A daughter born out of wedlock might be quietly married into a local noble family, her origins politely ignored, but her children would grow up with whispers circling them, reminders that, no matter how much wealth or comfort they had, legitimacy was something they would never inherit. Even when they were given opportunities, the label followed. Bastard was a scarlet word, an announcement of origin that could never quite be scrubbed clean. It followed them into adulthood, into politics, into every alliance and every quarrel. No matter how accomplished or loyal they were, there was always the lingering thought, but he was a bastard. And yet they also became strangely useful. Monarchs could deploy their illegitimate children as pawns, precisely because their claim to power was weaker. Bastards were ideal for commanding armies in their father's name, without becoming too much of a dynastic threat. They could be married off into strategic alliances, without raising as many fears of rival dynasties. They could be loyal servants, but rarely independent kings. This halfway status, neither fully excluded nor fully included, gave them a peculiar role in the machinery of monarchy. But perhaps their most enduring legacy lies not in their direct actions, but in the unease they represented. Every bastard child was a reminder that kings were not untouchable symbols of divine order, but flawed, impulsive human beings. Crowns rested on fragile lines of inheritance, yet lust and desire had little patience for neat succession plans. Bastards were the evidence of that chaos. They were the cracks in the facade of sacred kingship, the little reminders that even royal blood could spill into places it wasn't meant to. Over time, as dynasties rose and fell, the bastards slipped into shadow. Their names became harder to find, buried in marginalia, whispered in gossip, or remembered only when a historian needed to explain an awkward twist of inheritance. But the word survived. Bastard lingered in language, shedding its dynastic precision but keeping its sting. To call someone a bastard in modern speech is to unknowingly echo centuries of royal scandal, dynastic anxiety, and the children who were simultaneously part of the story and written out of it. So when we speak of medieval bastards, we're not just talking about a few unlucky children. We're talking about an entire category of people who existed in the gaps of history, shaping politics from the shadows, embodying society's deepest anxieties, and then fading into memory, and that, perhaps, is the quiet irony of their story. Kings wore crowns so their names would live forever. Bastards were denied crowns so their names would be forgotten. Yet here we are, centuries later, still whispering about them in the dark. Let's drift now, gently into our final reflections, where we close the curtain on their half-lived, half-remembered lives, embodying society's deepest anxieties and reminding us of the fragility of order itself. They were not rebels storming gates, nor heroes carving new thrones. Instead, they were the quiet disruptions, the living evidence that the carefully drawn lines of inheritance could be smudged with a single night's desire. And that is why their story endures. Not because they reshaped kingdoms with crowns on their heads, but because they showed time and again that crowns were never as secure as they seemed. Their lives were the fine print of history, the conditions and clauses that kings tried to hide, but could never fully erase. So, as we close this part, picture them one last time. The unnamed children walking past gilded halls they could never enter, the half-acknowledged sons riding into battle, useful but never trusted. The quiet daughters folded into noble families, their origins never fully forgotten. They are the shadows of medieval dynasties, forever present, forever denied, and perhaps that is their true legacy. Not thrones or titles, but the reminder that power has cracks, that legitimacy is only ever a story, and that even the mightiest kings left behind whispers they could not silence. With that, we can gently move into the final reflections, where all these half-lives settle into the long twilight of memory, embodying society's deepest anxieties and reminding us of the fragility of order itself. They were not rebels storming gates, nor heroes carving new thrones. Instead, they were the quiet disruptions, the living evidence that the carefully drawn lines of inheritance could be smudged with a single night's desire. And that is why their story endures. Not because they reshaped kingdoms with crowns on their heads, but because they showed time and again that crowns were never as secure as they seemed. Their lives were the fine print of history, the conditions and clauses that kings tried to hide but could never fully erase. Some of them left children of their own, creating quiet bloodlines that wove into the wider nobility. Others died young, remembered only as a whisper. To a few, the rare few, stood so close to power that they almost overturned dynasties, yet history always pulled them back into the shadows. Their stories are like fragments scattered across the medieval world, one in a parchment scroll, one in a ballad sung by firelight, one in a chronicler's bitter aside. None complete, but all hinting at lives caught between privilege and exclusion. So as we close this part, picture them one last time. The unnamed children walking past gilded halls they could never enter, the half-acknowledged sons riding into battle, useful but never trusted. The quiet daughters folded into noble families, their origins never fully forgotten. They are the shadows of medieval dynasties, forever present, forever denied, and perhaps that is their true legacy. Not thrones or titles, but the reminder that power has cracks, that legitimacy is only ever a story, and that even the mightiest kings left behind whispers they could not silence. With that, we can gently move into the final reflections, where all these half-lives settle into the long twilight of memory. And so we drift into the final reflections, where the echoes of these forgotten children soften into the background hum of history. If you think about it, bastards occupied a liminal space. They were both inside and outside of dynasties, close enough to touch power, yet barred from ever truly grasping it. They belonged but only halfway, and history itself seems to treat them the same way. The records keep them on the margins, never quite erasing, never quite embracing. There is something almost poetic about that. These children were born of human impulses, of fleeting desire, of mistakes both private and public. Yet they were judged not by who they were, but by the circumstances of their birth, circumstances they never chose. To medieval minds, legitimacy was a legal shield, a moral cloak, a divine stamp of approval. Without it, even the brightest talent or deepest loyalty could be overshadowed, and still, for all that, they mattered. They served in wars, brokered alliances, whispered into royal ears, and bore witness to events that shaped nations. They were not the stars of the stage, but they were always there in the wings, altering the scene by their very presence. Perhaps that is why we still return to them, because bastards remind us that history is not neat. It is not a tidy procession of kings and queens with clear crowns and clear titles. It is messy. It is full of contradictions, compromises, and people who didn't fit cleanly into the grand narrative. Bastards embody that untidiness. They are history's reminder that every dynasty was held together by both law and denial, by both ritual and forgetting. So as the candlelight of this story flickers low, imagine them lingering in the shadows of those medieval halls, not forgotten entirely but never celebrated, not legitimate but never insignificant. They are the quiet proof that even in a world obsessed with order, life had a way of spilling over the edges. And with that, dear listener, let the story drift closed. The bastards of medieval kings may be gone, their names blurred into the past, but their presence lingers in language, in memory, and in the quiet spaces between history's grand designs. And so we drift into the final reflections, where the echoes of these forgotten children soften into the background hum of history. If you think about it, bastards occupied a liminal space. They were both inside and outside of dynasties, close enough to touch power, yet barred from ever truly grasping it. They belonged, but only halfway, and history itself seems to treat them the same way. The records keep them on the margins, never quite erasing, never quite embracing. There is something almost poetic about that. These children were born of human impulses, a fleeting desire, of mistakes both private and public. Yet they were judged not by who they were, but by the circumstances of their birth, circumstances they never chose. To medieval minds, legitimacy was a legal shield, a moral cloak, a divine stamp of approval. Without it, even the brightest talent or deepest loyalty could be overshadowed, and still, for all that, they mattered. They served in wars, brokered alliances, whispered into royal ears, and bore witness to events that shaped nations. They were not the stars of the stage, but they were always there in the wings, altering the scene by their very presence. Some of them became guardians of their half-siblings. Some turned into rivals whose very existence haunted kings, and others simply faded away, never spoken of again, though the silence around them said just as much as any official decree. Perhaps that is why we still return to them. Because bastards remind us that history is not neat. It is not a tidy procession of kings and queens, with clear crowns and clear titles. It is messy. It is full of contradictions, compromises, and people who didn't fit cleanly into the grand narrative. Bastards embody that untidiness. They are history's reminder that every dynasty was held together by both law and denial, by both ritual and forgetting. When we look closely, we see that the story of monarchy is not just about the official heirs who sat on thrones, but also about those who hovered just beside them. Every time we trace a genealogy, there are names missing, names struck through, names written in faint ink. Those are the illegitimate children, shaping the story even in absence. Their erasure was intentional, yet their shadows were permanent. So as the candlelight of this story flickers low, imagine them lingering in the shadows of those medieval halls, not forgotten entirely but never celebrated. Not legitimate, but never insignificant. They are the quiet proof that even in a world obsessed with order, life had a way of spilling over the edges. And with that, dear listener, let your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts drift. The forgotten children of kings may have never worn crowns, but their existence still whispers through time, soft, uneasy but impossible to silence. And with that, dear listener, we let the story settle, the words fading like the last embers in a long cold hearth. Picture the great halls of Europe once more, the glittering banquets, the solemn coronations, the battles fought to protect fragile claims. Behind every crown stood not only the legitimate heirs and their careful lineages, but also the shadow children, moving in silence. Some hovered at the edge of power, others vanished into anonymity, yet all of them were part of the same story, woven into history's fabric, even if in faint and frayed threads. When you next hear the sweeping tales of kings and queens, remember that those stories are incomplete without the bastards. They carried the proof that rulers were not gods but mortals. They showed that love, lust, and weakness seeped into even the most sacred bloodlines. And they remind us that the past is not only about who reigned, but also about who was denied. So let your eyes grow heavier now, as we leave these forgotten children where history left them, lingering at the edges of dynasties, flickering in the half-light, suspended between memory and oblivion. Good night, and may your dreams be gentler than the lives of those who never found their place beneath the crown. And yet, even as we say good night to their stories, one more thought lingers. History, after all, has a way of flattening people into symbols. Kings become crowns, queens become marriages, bastards become scandals. But if we let ourselves drift slowly enough through the past, we can imagine the people behind the titles. A boy, barely 12, handed a sword and told to serve loyally at his father's side, knowing that no matter how bravely he fought, the crown would never be his. A girl dressed in fine silks for her wedding, but reminded in whispers that she was not born right, as though legitimacy could be stitched into her gown. A young man, educated, charismatic, admired by all, but always introduced with the pause. The bastard son of... as though even his name needed a warning label. These are the human shapes behind the word. Not just heirs denied, but children trying to live in the shadow of thrones too heavy for them to touch. And in that, perhaps, lies the quiet tragedy. That their lives were measured not by their choices or character, but by the circumstances of their birth. Circumstances that were never theirs to control. Medieval society could forgive a king's recklessness, but not the child who was born from it. So as you sink deeper into rest, let this story drift with you. The story of children who walked on the edges of history, who carried both privilege and stigma, and who remind us that power is never as clean as it looks in the chronicles. They were the shadows of crowns, the forgotten heirs, the bastards of kings, and though their names may fade, their presence lingers still in language, in memory, and in the soft echo of history's unfinished stories. Lassen's recklessness, but not the child who was born from it. The irony is almost soothing in its predictability. The crown could pardon itself 1,000 sins, but the illegitimate child would forever carry the burden of one they never committed. That was the rhythm of dynasties, the heartbeat of royal courts. And yet, scattered between the laws and chronicles, you find glimmers. A father who quietly left lands to his bastard son. A queen who raised her husband's illegitimate daughter as her own. A noble who wore the word bastard, not as a wound but as a banner, carving out a legacy that whispered louder than legitimacy ever could. These moments, rare as they were, remind us that history wasn't only cruelty. Sometimes the rules bent, sometimes affection cracked the stone of tradition, and sometimes the forgotten children wrote themselves into memory. So tonight, As you let your eyes close and drift into your own softer world, think of them, not as scandals, not as errors, but simply as people. Children who loved, who laughed, who worried, who hoped. Children who wanted nothing more dangerous than a place at the table. And perhaps in remembering them gently, we give them the place they were denied. A seat, at least, in the quiet halls of memory. As recklessness, but not the child who was born from it. The irony is almost soothing in its predictability. The crown could pardon itself 1,000 sins, but the illegitimate child would forever carry the burden of one they never committed. That was the rhythm of dynasties, the heartbeat of royal courts. And yet scattered between the laws and chronicles, you find glimmers. A father who quietly left lands to his bastard son. A queen who raised her husband's illegitimate daughter as her own. A noble who wore the word bastard, not as a wound but as a banner, carving out a legacy that whispered louder than legitimacy ever could. These moments, rare as they were, remind us that history wasn't only cruelty. Sometimes the rules bent, sometimes affection cracked the stone of tradition, and sometimes the forgotten children wrote themselves into memory. So tonight, as you let your eyes close and drift into your own softer world, think of them not as scandals, not as errors, but simply as people. Children who loved, who laughed, who worried, who hoped. Children who wanted nothing more dangerous than a place at the table. And perhaps in remembering them gently, we give them the place they were denied. A seat, at least, in the quiet halls of memory. Now, if you've noticed a recurring theme by this point, it's that illegitimacy in the medieval world wasn't just a label. It was a lifelong sentence, stitched into identity like an invisible brand. Bastards could be raised at court, educated alongside princes, even serve as loyal companions. But at the crucial moment, the moment of succession, of inheritance, of recognition, the invisible line would appear, and they'd be reminded exactly who they were. Imagine being told you were clever enough to advise a king, brave enough to fight for him, loyal enough to die in his service, but never quite enough to inherit his bloodline. It's like being hired for every job in the kingdom, except the one you were literally born into. And yet kings themselves had a way of being. Selective, convenient, you might say. One illegitimate son could be given lands and a title, another quietly packed off to a monastery, and a third simply ignored. The logic was less about morality and more about utility. A bastard who strengthened the king's hand was worth keeping around. A bastard who threatened his heirs was a liability. What makes it quietly tragic is that many of these children walked a tightrope. They had to embody loyalty while living with rejection. They had to smile in the presence of half-brothers and sisters who would one day rule them. And they had to make peace with the fact that their very existence was both proof of their father's power and a reminder of his failure to control himself. Let's not forget the mothers, too. For them, bearing a royal bastard could mean anything from sudden elevation to total disgrace. Some were pensioned off with gifts and land. Others were cast aside, their names whispered only in gossip. The children carried not only their father's shadow, but their mother's fate. So when we picture bastards of kings, don't just imagine scheming nobles or doomed rebels. Think of quiet courtyards where children played together, knowing one wore a crown by right and another by accident. Think of a dinner table where a boy smiled at his father, the king, knowing his presence was tolerated, not celebrated. This is the quieter heartbeat of dynasties. The stories told not in coronation oaths, but in sighs and silences. So let's linger a little longer with these shadow children of medieval royalty, because truth be told, their lives deserve more than a passing glance. If the chronicles only mention them in margins, then maybe here, in the soft space between wakefulness and sleep, we can let their stories breathe. Now, the first thing to remember about bastards is that their fortunes were inconsistent. That's the polite way of saying it. One royal father might acknowledge his illegitimate offspring and treat them like minor nobles. Another might pretend they didn't exist, except when rumors swirled so loudly he had to admit it. And then there were those rare cases where kings practically paraded their bastards around as trophies, living proof of virility, even if legitimacy was off the table. Take, for example, Henry I of England. If there was ever a king who seemed determined to test the limits of biology, it was him. Chroniclers tell us he fathered at least 20 illegitimate children, and probably more. The official number depends on how many medieval scribes you trust. But let's just say that Henry was not a man who spent his evenings quietly reading scripture by the fire. What's fascinating is how differently he treated them. Many of Henry's bastards were married off strategically, given land or tucked into useful marriages. His daughters, in particular, were married into the nobility, creating alliances that bolstered his political standing. His sons, meanwhile, could find themselves in command of castles or even leading armies. In a strange twist, Henry seemed to trust his illegitimate brood almost more than some of his legitimate courtiers. After all, they were bound to him by blood, even if not by law. But there's the rub. That loyalty could never translate into inheritance. When Henry's legitimate son and heir, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, the question of succession loomed large. Henry had illegitimate sons, capable, ambitious, and ready to step up, but none could legally inherit. The crown, by the iron logic of legitimacy, could not pass to them. So instead, Henry named his daughter Empress Matilda as heir. Cue decades of civil war. The bastards may have been many, but none of them mattered when the throne itself was on the line. It's a classic medieval contradiction. A king could shower his illegitimate children with wealth, affection, and responsibility. But the one thing they could never hold was the very symbol of his power, the crown. Now let's float across the Channel for a moment. In France, the situation could be even more precarious. The French monarchy was almost religiously obsessed with the concept of legitimacy. The Capetian kings, for instance, were always keen to draw sharp lines between their lawful heirs and anyone who might confuse the issue. That didn't stop them from fathering plenty of children on the side. Of course, it just meant those children were carefully managed, like awkward secrets at a family reunion. Sometimes, bastards were given positions in the church. This was both convenient and cruel. Convenient, because placing them in bishoprics or abbeys kept them useful while eliminating any threat to succession. Cruel because it closed the door on other ambitions. A bastard son might have dreamed of riding into battle, commanding men, or even marrying well. Instead, he found himself cloistered in stone walls, chanting prayers, and watching the world go on without him. And yet, this could be a path to influence. Medieval abbots and bishops were not powerless figures. Some bastards actually thrived in these roles, carving out legacies in the church rather than the court. Still, one imagines the bittersweet nature of it. To serve God not out of personal calling, but because your father couldn't risk you serving yourself. But let's not forget that not every bastard faded into quiet service. Some rose to remarkable prominence, almost redefining what illegitimacy meant in their time. Consider William the Conqueror himself. Yes, the man who invaded England in 1066, defeated Harold at Hastings, and reshaped the English monarchy. He was, in fact, known in his youth as William the Bastard. That was his literal nickname. Not exactly the most flattering title for a future king. His mother, Herleva, was not married to his father, Robert the Magnificent, Duke of Normandy. This meant William's claim was shaky from the start. But here's the irony. William's illegitimacy didn't stop him from seizing power. If anything, it seemed to fuel his relentless drive. He spent much of his early life fighting off rivals who mocked his birth, who sneered that a bastard could never rule. And yet, by sheer force of will and probably a fair amount of brutality, he proved them wrong. By the time he crowned himself King of England, the insult bastard had become less of a taunt and more of a badge of resilience. So here's one of those ironies I promised you. In most cases, bastards were denied thrones, and yet one of the most famous kings in European history owed his entire legacy to the fact that he overcame that label. It's a reminder that history isn't always tidy. Rules bend. Exceptions break through, and sometimes the least likely child writes the largest story. Now, drifting back down from William's soaring conquest, let's return to the quieter side of things. Because for every William who fought his way to power, there were hundreds of nameless bastards who simply vanished. Their names don't survive in chronicles. Their lives don't make it into textbooks. But they were there, living in castles, in villages, in monasteries, laughing, crying, working, waiting, forgotten, because their fathers didn't think it necessary to write them into the record. It makes you wonder how many lineages today carry royal blood without even realizing it. How many descendants of kings now live ordinary lives because their ancestor was born on the wrong side of the marriage bed? In that sense, illegitimacy didn't erase royal blood. It simply scattered it more widely. The DNA of kings and queens might flow through countless families today, hidden in everyday faces. A strange kind of democracy, born out of secrecy. And while we're on that note, let's consider the strange half-acceptance of bastards in court life. Some were openly acknowledged. Some were even celebrated. Others were treated like ghostly presences, tolerated but never truly embraced. At royal feasts, for instance, a bastard son might be seated at the high table, but just far enough away to make his rank clear. At tournaments, he might compete with skill, but always under a cloud of suspicion. Was he a loyal knight or a threat to the true heirs? Imagine the mental gymnastics required to live that way. To be part of the family, but never fully. To be included, but only up to a point. It's the medieval equivalent of being forever stuck in the friend zone of dynasties. And then there's the emotional layer. We often speak of these children in political terms, alliances, inheritances, marriages, but at the heart of it, they were just children. Many of them wanted what every child wants: recognition, affection, stability. Some received it. Many didn't. A father might hold a bastard son on his knee when the boy was small, only to later marry him off to secure a treaty, or send him to a cloister where affection became irrelevant. The bonds of blood were filtered through the cold lens of dynastic strategy. Perhaps the quiet tragedy of bastards is that their existence highlighted the gap between human nature and royal duty. Kings, after all, were men, subject to desire, weakness, and mistakes. Their illegitimate children were proof of that humanity. And yet the machinery of monarchy required those children to be erased, ignored, or diminished, because kings needed to appear divine, untouchable beyond ordinary flaws. In that sense, bastards were living contradictions. They embodied both the humanity of kings and the cruelty of dynasties. Too human to deny, too inconvenient to embrace, and so their stories often drifted to the margins, waiting for us to pause centuries later and remember them again. Now, to understand just how complex this all was, we need to drift into the world of law and religion, because medieval society didn't just disapprove of bastards. It codified that disapproval into rules that lasted centuries. The church, for instance, had very firm views. According to canon law, illegitimate children were barred from holding certain offices. Technically, they weren't supposed to become priests, bishops, or abbots unless they received a special dispensation from the Pope. And these dispensations weren't given lightly. The logic was simple. If you were born outside the sacred bonds of marriage, you were considered marked by sin. And yet, ironically, Many popes and bishops themselves fathered illegitimate children, so the whole system operated on a kind of holy double standard. It's one of those great medieval contradictions. The very institution that condemned bastards was also full of men who quietly created them. And of course, when it was politically convenient, those rules could bend. A king's illegitimate son might suddenly find himself in line for a cushy abbacy. A noble bastard might receive papal permission to rise higher. So much for moral consistency. In England, there was also a legal distinction that mattered: the concept of legitimation. In some cases, if the parents of a bastard later married, the child could be legitimized. This was known in Roman law and carried over in parts of medieval Europe, though England was stricter. English common law had a very blunt phrase for it: once a bastard, always a bastard. No amount of retroactive marriage could erase it. France, on the other hand, was more flexible. The king could, by royal declaration, legitimize his offspring, making them eligible for inheritance, though usually not for the throne itself. This is where politics stepped in. Legitimization wasn't really about fairness. It was about usefulness. If a king needed a loyal son to help hold the borders, suddenly his birth didn't matter so much. If a nobleman died without heirs and his illegitimate children were the only option, suddenly the church might find a way to look the other way. Rules were rules until they weren't. But let's not get lost in legal texts. Let's come back to people, because some royal bastards became legends in their own right, shaping dynasties in ways the law never anticipated. Take Charles II of England, known as the Merry Monarch. Charles had no legitimate children with his wife, Catherine of Braganza, but illegitimate ones. Oh, he had plenty. By the time he was done, he had fathered at least a dozen children with various mistresses. And unlike earlier kings, Charles openly acknowledged many of them. He gave them titles, lands, and positions. The Dukes of Grafton, St. Albans, Richmond, and others all trace their lineage back to Charles's bastards. In fact, here's a fun irony. Although Charles II's legitimate line died out, his illegitimate descendants went on to marry into noble families and, over time, interweave with the bloodlines of later monarchs. Some of today's European aristocracy actually descend from those bastards. So in a way, illegitimacy didn't stop the blood, it just took a detour. Then there's the case of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III of England. John had children with his mistress Catherine Swynford, while still married to someone else. These children were born Beauforts, technically illegitimate. But later, after John finally married Catherine, the Pope and the King agreed to legitimize them. The Beauforts went on to become enormously influential, and eventually, through a winding genealogical path, their bloodline merged with the Tudors. Which means, yes, Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, owed his crown to a once illegitimate line. A royal bastard, in other words, sat on the throne of England. That's the paradox again. Society scorned them. Laws excluded them. Yet dynasties could not seem to avoid them. They haunted the edges of power like persistent shadows, sometimes rising to reshape history itself. But for every Beaufort or William the Conqueror, there were countless others who never escaped the margins. Many were quietly married off to lower-ranking nobles, effectively dissolving their royal blood into local gentry. Others were placed in monasteries, their names erased from worldly affairs. Some lived lives of uneasy half-acceptance, tolerated at court, but always introduced with that hesitation: the natural son of the king. Imagine how that sounded, repeated over and over at feasts and councils. Your name never standing on its own, always tethered to an explanation of why you didn't quite belong. It's like carrying a permanent footnote, one you can never erase. And let's not forget the emotional dimension. Kings were often affectionate toward their illegitimate children, especially when they were young. But affection in private didn't always translate into recognition in public. A king might play with his bastard son in the nursery, only to later refuse him a place in succession. He might dote on a daughter, only to marry her off to a loyal knight rather than a great prince. For the children, the line between love and rejection was blurry at best. Perhaps the most poignant stories are those of bastards who loved their fathers, but were used as pawns. In some cases, a king might call on his illegitimate son to fight in wars, to lead troops, or to hold dangerous frontier lands. These children could serve loyally, bleed for their father, even die in his service. And yet when the king himself died, the bastard was left with nothing. Loyalty, it seemed, did not cancel illegitimacy. And what about the mothers? Their fates varied just as wildly. Some were quietly provided for, receiving lands, manors, or pensions in exchange for silence. Others were cast aside when their usefulness ended. A few, like Catherine Swynford, managed to secure love and legitimacy in the end. But most were relegated to whispers in the margins. History recorded the kings and occasionally the bastards, but almost never the women who bore them. When you step back, you begin to see bastards not just as individuals, but as reflections of the fragility of dynasties. They were reminders that royal power was not neat or clean, but messy, human, and often hypocritical. The very existence of these children revealed that kings were men first, rulers second. And medieval society never quite knew what to do with that. So Part 6 drifts to a wider view now. We see bastards as the contradictions of monarchy. At once loved and unloved, useful and disposable, present and absent, they were the children who lived in the twilight of legitimacy. Never fully in the light, never entirely in the dark. And in remembering them, we remember that even in the most rigid of systems, humanity has a way of slipping through. The kings tried to control lineage, purity, inheritance, but life has always refused to be tidy. Royal bastards who changed history cooker. As we drift a little further into this moonlit stroll through forgotten airs, let's pause on some very particular figures. Royal bastards whose lives were more than just marginal footnotes, because while most faded into anonymity, a few carved their names so deeply into history that they almost redefined what it meant to be illegitimate. The first, of course, is the one we've already touched on, William the Conqueror. But let's linger with him for a moment longer, because his story deserves a slow telling. Born around 1028 to Robert, Duke of Normandy, and his mistress Herlever, William carried the mocking label William the Bastard. That alone could have doomed him. And yet his sheer persistence was astonishing. As a child, his position was perilous. Norman nobles doubted him, rivals mocked him, and assassination attempts were common. One by one, his guardians were murdered, leaving the young William to somehow hold on. It's as if illegitimacy painted a target on his back, but also sharpened his survival instincts. By the time he invaded England in 1066, the insult that once weighed him down had become a perverse badge of strength. His enemies had underestimated him, and that mistake changed England forever. William is the exception, though. Most royal bastards didn't conquer kingdoms, they served them. Take, for instance, the children of Henry III of England. I mentioned earlier that he fathered a remarkable number of illegitimate sons and daughters, probably more than 20. These children were scattered across noble marriages and military posts, strengthening Henry's influence far beyond his legitimate line. His daughter Sibylla even married Alexander the Round of Scotland, becoming queen consort. Imagine that. An illegitimate daughter of an English king sitting on the Scottish throne. The irony, of course, is that while she wore a crown, she could not pass on any claim to her children. She was royal enough to marry a king, but not royal enough to make her blood legitimate. That was the strange line bastards always walked. exalted yet diminished. Well, let's float forward to the Beaufort family in England, descended from John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. Their children were legitimized after John finally married Catherine, but with one major caveat: they were barred from inheriting the English throne. At least that was the rule on paper. In practice, the Beaufort bloodline fed directly into the Wars of the Roses. Margaret Beaufort, great-granddaughter of John and Catherine, became the mother of Henry Tudor, and when Henry VII seized the crown in 1485, the throne of England was suddenly resting on a bloodline that had once been considered illegitimate. So much for rules. But England wasn't the only place where bastards left fingerprints on history. Let's glance towards Scotland, where illegitimacy was treated with a little more flexibility. The Scottish kings, perhaps less obsessed with rigid succession laws, often acknowledged their illegitimate children quite openly. James V, for example, had several illegitimate sons who were granted abbeys, lands, and influence. James IV, too, had children outside of marriage, including Alexander, who became Archbishop of St. Andrews. In Scotland, bastards were often woven into the machinery of power rather than hidden away. It didn't erase the stigma entirely, but it gave them more room to breathe. And then there's the church. Yes, the very institution that railed against illegitimacy produced its own famous bastards. The Borgia family, for instance, gave us Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, both illegitimate children of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, who later became Pope Alexander XII. Cesare, in particular, became infamous as a ruthless general and political schemer, the kind of man whose life later inspired Machiavelli's The Prince. His illegitimacy didn't slow him down. If anything, it gave him the sharp edge of someone who had to fight for his place at the table. So here we are, drifting through a gallery of royal bastards who shaped dynasties, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. They were living contradictions, excluded in theory but indispensable in practice. History wanted them in the margins, but they kept scribbling themselves into the center. And perhaps that's the real story. Illegitimacy was supposed to be a barrier, but in so many cases it became a catalyst, a reason to fight harder, to climb further, to prove themselves in ways legitimate heirs never had to. The crown was denied to them, but power found its way into their hands nonetheless. So as we continue our journey through the twilight of medieval dynasties, let's linger even longer with these royal bastards who, despite society's scorn, managed to leave their mark. Some did it quietly, behind the curtain of official history. Others made their presence so unavoidable that entire kingdoms had to reckon with them. Starting with William the Conqueror, because we can't ignore the king who literally turned the word bastard into a footnote in English history. Young William's early life was perilous in every possible sense. Born to Robert, Duke of Normandy, and his mistress Helena, he faced the constant threat of assassination, rebellion, and betrayal. His status as a bastard made him a target from birth, yet it also seems to have forged a survival instinct. By the time he crossed the English Channel in 1066, the same label that could have destroyed him had instead sharpened him. The irony is thick and sweet. A man called the Bastard took a crown and reshaped England forever. Contrast that with Henry I of England, whose prolific fatherhood created an entire network of illegitimate children scattered across Europe. He had at least 20, probably more, each strategically married or positioned. Some of his daughters became queens in Scotland and France. His sons were military commanders, landholders, and loyal enforcers. Yet the legal system remained strict. None could inherit the throne. And when Henry's legitimate heir, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster, the succession crisis ignited a civil war known as the Anarchy. Here's a quiet reflection. Illegitimate children, however capable, were powerless when dynastic law drew a line. Their lives were shaped not by talent or loyalty, but by circumstances of birth, a reminder of the harsh arithmetic of medieval inheritance. Meanwhile, across England, the Beaufort family demonstrates another curious twist of fate. John of Gaunt fathered children with Catherine Swynford, who were initially illegitimate. Later legitimized, yet barred from the throne, these children's bloodline eventually led to Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. Rules tried to contain illegitimacy, but dynasties found ways around them. It's as if history itself refused to be neat, bending the law to the will of the living, while still whispering that these children were once outside the line of power. Traveling north to Scotland, bastards often had a more open passage into influence. James IV, for example, fathered several illegitimate children who were granted lands, ecclesiastical positions, and military commands. Alexander Stewart, an illegitimate son, became Archbishop of St. Andrews, a position of great influence. In Scotland, illegitimacy didn't erase power completely. It redirected it. These children could shape politics, fight in wars, and serve as the silent gears of dynasties. Yet even there, stigma lingered. They were part of the family, yet forever reminded of what they could not inherit. In the papal courts of Renaissance Italy, illegitimacy became another kind of paradox. Rodrigo Borgia, who later became Pope Alexander VI, fathered children outside marriage. Cesare Borgia, his illegitimate son, carved a fearsome path through Italy, eventually inspiring Machiavelli's The Prince. Lucrezia Borgia, similarly, navigated marriages and politics with the subtle skill of someone fully aware that her legitimacy, or lack thereof, defined her opportunities. Here we see a pattern again.